Chapter 20. Intuk drew the route with a stick on the sands of the beach. He showed several small bays, a string of offshore islands, then a great headland jutting into the sea. Allan committed the map to memory. The hunters had no maps or charts, nor could they write. But they had excellent memories and were capable of tracing a coastline with their knives on a flat piece of bone or drawing it from memory on sand or gravel. Enough dried fish and caribou and seal meat to last a week was stowed into the front of the kayak. Everyone, it seemed, brought Allan a present, a piece of clothing or a special item of food. They crowded around him on the beach, and old Hermit hobbled down to lay his hands on Allan's head and bless him. And although Hermit could not read, Allan gave him his Bible as a present, because he knew how much the old man would treasure a history of his faith. The only one who was missing was Panu. Peely said that Panu had run off and was hiding back in the heather because she could not bear to see Allan go away. Even Intuk seemed sorry to see Allan leave. "If you do not find your ships, then come back to us," Intuk said. "I will," Allan promised. Then he gave Eric his fowling piece, and hugged him and Lifa his wife, and climbed into the canoe. His paddle flashed as he drove the kayak out from shore. As long as he was in sight, the people on the beach kept waving to him. Finally, though, he rounded a point of land, and even the tents were no longer visible. By now, Allan had learned how to handle one of the tribe's skin canoes, and he made slow but steady progress, following the shoreline to the south. It was strange, but he now felt homesick for his friends. He had grown to love their simple ways and quiet dignity. Indeed, he halfway hoped that he would not find a whaling ship and be forced to return to the village. Think of the welcome he would get, and the feast that would be made ready. Because it was late summer, with almost continuous daylight, Allan could travel all day and most of the night if he wanted to. Once in a while, though, he would land, prop the canoe on edge to provide shelter from the wind, and cut himself a few slices of seal meat, and grab a couple of hours of sleep. As soon as he woke up, he would return to the sea again. There was still plenty of loose ice on the water, but Allan was able to maneuver his kayak through the floes without any trouble. On his third day out, Allan came to the great headland jutting out from shore. He landed his canoe, climbed to the top of the hill, and looked to the south. A beautiful sight met his eyes. There, out on the open sea, were two whale ships, both with full sail and drawing away from him. He hurried back down to the foot of the cliff, launched his kayak, and gave chase. He rounded the bluff and now saw that no matter how hard he paddled, the ships were too far away and moving too swiftly to overtake. For a while he rested in the canoe, very, very tired and very unhappy that he had missed the ships. Then he turned the kayak around and headed back to shore. Dragging the canoe well up on the beach, he examined his store of food. He unwrapped the caribou skin bundles that contained meat and a dozen dried fish. He had enough, if he ate sparingly, for another 4 or 5 days, maybe even a week. He would camp there on top of the bluff and keep an eye on the open water to the north. There was still a very good chance that more whaling ships would be coming through. And like the ships already gone past, they would probably sail within sight of the bluff. The high bluff was a good landmark, and unless a ship came through while Allan happened to be taking a nap, he was almost sure to spot anything heading for the point. Making sure that his canoe was well above the high water mark, Allan unloaded half his food to be carried to the top of the bluff. The rest of the food he left inside the upturned kayak. If he needed more food, he could come back for it later. On top of the bluff, he stored the meat and fish under a layer of rocks. He scraped out a hollow on the windward side of his rock pile and settled down to wait. He would camp there until his supply of food ran out. Then he could always go hungry for the 3 or 4 days that it would take him to return to the tribe. His only problem was water. However, he knew that some of the ice floes were made of old sea ice from which the salt had already been melted out. All he had to do was paddle out and locate an old floe. He looked out over the water. As far to the north as he could see, the surface was studded with ice floes. It would not be long now, he thought, until those floes came together to form rafts and islands and continents of ice that would completely cover whatever open sea was left. Because he had nothing to do, he decided to make a stone landmark, a tower of rocks and stones that could be seen from far out to sea. The Eskimos often made such towers to guide them to certain spots on land when later they were far out on the frozen ice, or in kayaks on the sea. Fortunately, there were plenty of rocks on top of the bluff, and he spent 5 or 6 hours building his tower. When it was finished, it stood about 10 feet tall. Then Allan took the canoe paddle, tied a caribou wrapping skin to the blade, and stuck the paddle on top of the tower. Finally, he stood back to admire his handiwork, his signal for help. Now, if he were sleeping and a ship drew close, his makeshift flag might be enough to draw a landing party. As he waited, he thought how foolish he had been to give away his fowling piece. He might have been able to shoot some birds, ptarmigan or seagulls, or even use the shotgun to signal with. On the other hand, it would have been hard to keep the gunpowder dry in the kayak, and, anyway, Eric needed the gun more than he did. It was just as well. He had brought along his carving knife. He needed it to cut pieces off the frozen fish and seal meat. After years of use, the knife looked nothing like the knife Allan had picked up on the Ann Forbes. The blade had been ground away so much that it was only half the length that it used to be. In fact, Allan had to be very careful when using the knife. The metal was now so thin that the blade might easily snap in two. As the hours passed and Allan waited in his shelter, he grew more and more lonely. It was the first time since the Ann Forbes had gone down that he found himself completely alone. Always before, there had been either the members of the tribe or Nancy for company. He wondered now where his pet bear was, and supposed that she had already raised several families since leaving him. He still missed her, and he knew that he would miss his Viking descendant friends. He had grown to love them all, even Intuk. Often he had spent weeks at a stretch with a half a dozen others confined to a tiny igloo or tent, with hardly room to turn around. Such confinement either made for deep hatreds or long-lasting friendships, and he had been very lucky in that only friendships had grown out of his experiences. In fact, after he and Eric had almost starved to death on that one trip, they had come to love each other, and Eric often called Allan his brother. As he waited on the bluff, Allan was tempted several times to give up his search and return to the tribe. He had been happy with those simple and kind friends of his, and anyone who remembered him back in Aberdeen would remember him only as a young lad who had been lost at sea. Even his mother and sisters would have gotten over his disappearance by now. And Nancy? It was when he thought of Nancy that he knew he had to go back. He had promised her that he would return, that nothing would happen to him, and he intended to keep that promise. One thing his long years in the Arctic had taught Allan, and that was patience. Where another, less experienced man might have paddled up and down the shoreline looking for ships, perhaps losing himself or dying of exhaustion, Allan calmly waited on the bluff, knowing that if any ships were still around, they would eventually pass his lookout point. He did not have long to wait. The next day he spotted sails to the north, what appeared to be a 3-masted bark. He grabbed his paddle, came running down the bluff, and launched his canoe. He set a course that would cut across the vessel's path, paddled out, and waited. Several hours later, the whaling ship bore down on him, its deck crowded with curious sailors. Allan rested his paddle across the kayak and shouted up, "I'm a shipwreck, a castaway. Can I come aboard?" None of the sailors made any offer to help, and the captain, standing on the quarterdeck, angrily waved Allan off, making signals for the kayak to return to shore. Allan was stunned, and for a moment unable to think. As the ship slid past, he reached out and touched the wooden side of the vessel. He had touched a ship bound for Europe, a ship that could carry him back to Scotland, and yet no one on the ship would even talk to him. For several moments the kayak bounced around in the larger vessel's wake. Then Allan drove his small canoe out of the rough water and rested for a moment as he stared after the whale ship. He found it hard to believe what was happening. They had actually no intention of taking him on board.